So welcome everyone to this webinar series. I'm very pleased to welcome Lynda Gratton to our Foresight Lab webinar series here at McMaster University. Lynda comes to us from London Business School, and we are so fortunate for Zoom to have her here. At London Business School, Lynda is a professor of management practice. She also founded the advisory practice HSM Advisory, and in addition to her teaching, writing, and speaking, Lynda is a member of the Council of the World Economic Forum, where she is currently co-chair of the WEF Global Future Council on Work, Wages, and Job Creation. So that's a lot, but in addition, she is an award-winning teacher and an award-winning author. She's written 10 books, which together have sold more than 1 million copies. Lynda's writing focuses on the future of work and the role of the corporation. Her latest book, which is co-authored with Andrew Scott, and you can see here on the screen, is titled The New Long Life, a framework for flourishing in a changing world. She also writes frequently for Harvard Business Review and has a recent front cover magazine piece in that magazine. So we're so lucky to have Lynda here today. She will share with us her thoughts about key trends that are shaping work and organizational practice. Lynda will speak for about 30 minutes, and after that we will have a 30-minute Q&A where I will pose questions to Lynda about her work. So during her talk, I invite you to share questions that you have for Lynda, thoughts, ideas in the chat box. I will put these together and post them to Lynda in the Q&A period. And I think that's it. So over to you, Lynda.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Erin. And it's great to be here, and also with my great friend, Len, who Len and I, of course, were at London Business School together before you pulled him over to Canada. So hi, Len. Lovely, lovely, lovely to see you. So what a pleasure. And thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's great to see so many people on the webinar. As Erin said, my real focus of attention really for the last 30 years has been on work, and more specifically on the forces that are going to shape work. Now, I know that that's very much part of what you're doing within the Institute, so I'm thrilled that I can have an opportunity to talk about that today and to talk with you to it. So we've got great comments already. Please keep them going. I'm just one of those people who not going to be able to read the comments and do my presentation at the same time, but I'll sort of take a little sneak view at them occasionally. I'm going to speak, as Erin said, for about half an hour to share some of the big themes that I'm working on right now, and then we're going to open up for conversation. So do please put your comments, conversation into the chat, and so that when we open up, Erin and I can talk to each other, but also I hope talk to you. I'm going to share my screen just to give you, here we are. Great. Okay, that's super. Okay, so where are we? Well, you know, I think as we think about the future of work, our minds right now are very much focused on the pandemic. And I'm going to talk about the impact of the pandemic shortly. But I think, you know, what we need to do now as we think about the future of work is to balance short-term with long-term issues. So in the short term, there is a huge focus on how do we get through the next months, the next 6 months. And actually, my advisory group, HSM, had a masterclass for most of today, which brought people from all over the world to talk about, more than 100 people joined us to talk about how we're going to think about this. And there's no question that in the surveys and mentees that we ran, even today, people are very much focused on the short-term issues. But I think it's really important that we, as people who are interested in the future, also balance that with some of the big issues that are going to, you know, come to the surface over the coming years. So what I'm going to do today is to briefly run through the major forces that I think all of us need to be aware of as we think about the future, and to think about the future in terms of how we work and how we live. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about what I think some of the issues that companies now have to grapple with, and indeed take a look at how they're grappling with them. Obviously, I'm going to start with automation. And it's been really interesting, I think, to remind ourselves that the pandemic has absolutely pushed forward the agenda for technological innovation. And we can see this in so many different ways. All of us became very skilled at using Zoom. We all became digital natives, as it were. And at the same time, we felt much more comfortable moving our learning onto a platform. So the platform companies that I know, the CEOs are saying to me, we've never seen so many people on our platforms, learning from our platforms. And I think the other thing which I find fascinating is that what this has done is, as we've really become connected to each other digitally, I think that that's had the impact of accelerating the demise of the hierarchy. You know, when on a platform like this, everybody can talk to each other, as they're doing in some of the companies that we know. The CEO is talking to, you know, often 100,000 people or 10,000. We've just run a platform where we had 50,000 people talking to each other about the future of work. What this is doing is democratizing work. So the impact of automation, we can really think about it in terms of how jobs are changing. You know, so for so many of our jobs, we have to understand that they're going to be automated, and at the same time, new jobs will be created. But I think it's actually more than this. I think it's also that the digital agenda, which is allowing many to talk to many, I think that many-to-many conversation, which we've learned through the pandemic, is going to be very difficult to get back to hierarchies again. You know, when you're now used to chatting to your CEO and seeing them at home with their kids and their dogs and their cats and whatever, I don't know if that you're ever going to be able to get back to them, seeing them as this somehow removed character who's at the top of a hierarchy, which is maybe 8 or 9 levels above you. So, I mean, certainly what we're going to see is an acceleration, both in terms of you know, the augmentation of work, but also, of course, in terms of AI and machines entirely replacing quite a lot of the tasks that are done now. And that puts, I think, a real emphasis on people's capacity to become lifelong learners. You know, if you say to somebody, oh, do you realize that 60% of the tasks that you now do are going to be either done by a machine or entirely automated, or you will be working with a machine in terms of augmentation? That means that our jobs are not going to stay the same. And when people respond to that, if they're going to respond in a positive way, they have to talk about lifelong learning. So I'm going to talk today about a few big themes I see emerging, but I just want to say that one of those, without a doubt, is lifelong learning. And of course, as we've learned to learn on Zoom with each other, with our peers, then that's also going to accelerate it. I'm not going to say that all learning should be online. I'm not going to say that. But what I would say is it's really giving us amazing choice and options in terms of how we do learn. Okay, so that's really, I've been looking at that, as some of you have as well, I know, for many years, the impact of automation. But actually, when Andrew Scott, who's a colleague of mine at London Business School, an economist, started to talk about the future of work, we felt that people weren't taking into consideration sufficiently issues of longevity. And that, in fact, as we live longer, this also will profoundly impact our sense of identity. Erin, as an identity scholar, of course, is very much onto this topic, but our identity changes. You know, if you think you're going to live to 100 years, that's very different than thinking you're going to live till 60 years. And so Andrew Scott and I wrote The 100-Year Life, and then another book, The New Long Life, specifically about that, really addressing the question of what happens when everybody lives to 100. Now, this is best practice, life expectancy. You can see that it's gone right up since the 1850s. By the way, if you track that, there's 3 main reasons for that. 1850s, life expectancy went up because people didn't die in the population when they were children. It went up in the 1950s partly because people, well, in the 80s, it went up because people stopped smoking or didn't smoke so much. In the 50s, it went up because you were less likely to die of a heart attack. And of course, now it's going up again, in part because we've learned how to live healthily. We're not smoking, we're eating more healthy foods. Will it continue? I really have no idea. But actually, what it's meaning is people now also are seeing their age as being malleable. And that for me is a very important point, that, you know, if you were going to die at 60 and everybody around you died at 60, there wasn't really anything you could do to change your expectancy, life expectancy. But if you say, actually, you could live until you were 100, but to do that, there's three things you need to do. You need to take exercise every day, you need to eat healthily, and you need to sleep 8 hours a day. Well, suddenly that people are then have a great deal more personal agency and began to see their lives much more with regard to personal agency. The other issue there is that as lifestyle choices affect how people age, you see a great deal more variance within age cohorts. So you could be 70 and, you know, teaching full-time at London Business School or at McMaster's, or you could be 70 and, you know, sitting at home saying, you know, gosh, I'm so old, 70 is so old. So you are seeing a great deal of variance. You're also, by the way, seeing a great deal of inequality. Right now in London, for example, I live in one of the more educated parts of London, the richer parts of London, you know, even 2 miles away in one of the poor estates, people's life expectancy is 12 years less than mine. And what that means is it's very difficult, for example, for governments to make policy, because it isn't fair to say, you know, you can't take your retirement pension until you're 70. It's okay to say that to me because I'm perfectly capable of working till I'm 70, but it's not fair for people who have lower life expectancy and also who do manual work. So you're seeing, I'm actually involved with the UK government at the moment on this issue, and I can see that it's a real difficulty for governments. So here's what's happening with age. And by the way, another thing is happening with regard to age. Not only is are we living longer, 2 or 3 years every decade, more of that time is healthy. By the way, there's no evidence that morbidity, the period that we're ill before we die, that's decreased, I'm afraid. But of course, if you put that as a fraction of your whole life, it's a much smaller fraction. Another thing to say, though, before I move on, is just to remind us that in most developed countries of the world, Canada would be one, UK would be another. Not only are people living longer, but they're having fewer children. And that combination of living longer, having fewer children, means that the population ages. Now, I've been very involved with Japan. Japan, I don't know if you can see, oh, here it is. Here's the Japanese. Oh yeah, the Japanese version of my book. It sold 750,000 copies in Japan. It was made into a manga. Yeah, it's a really big deal. It sold more copies than 50 Shades of Grey. That tells you quite a lot, I think, doesn't it? But the reason it sold so many copies is Japan is very cognizant of the fact that it's an aging population. You know, the average age is in the mid-40s. Many people are over 60. But actually, Japan is just the first country to age. Next up is China. And China actually will age faster than Japan has aged. So the other issue about, as we think about the future, is you better get over the fact that 60 isn't old. It really isn't old. And actually, we should have different expectations of what we want 60-year-olds to be doing, and 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds. The third trend I want to talk about briefly is what's happening to societies. And of course, the big story there is families and women. Women, this is not a picture of my family in the 1950s on the left, but it could be. Here is dad, he had a career, here is mum. my mum went to university, as some women did in the 40s. But as soon as she had me in 1955, she stopped working, as many women did. She did part-time, she went back and did unpaid work, volunteer work, but she never actually had a career. She was a carer. And of course, by the way, that really continued right up until the 60s and 70s. And one of the issues now for women of my age is because they had jobs and not careers, they don't have pensions. And that's, again, just an issue of inequality that's being played out right now. So what you saw in the 60s and 70s is women started to be educated in larger numbers. They started to work, but they often had jobs, by which I mean they moved in and out of the labour market. It's much more common now for women to work. And that means that many families, whatever their gender, are headed by people who are working, many of whom are working full time. And I do think that, you know, I know there's a big reset going on. I don't know if you're talking about it a lot in Canada. We are. My brother actually runs one of the big recruitment agencies here. And he says, you know, Lynda, about 50% of people are looking for jobs right now. Now, of course, it doesn't mean they're going to take a job, but it's a huge, and actually, I don't think organizations yet realize that when they're talking to somebody about a job, they're also talking to two people. And that, in fact, one of the reasons people are beginning to say, I want flexibility more than money, is they're talking about a joint household income. Erin, I can see you nodding to this. They're talking about a joint household income, not an individual income. So we have still really not in any way caught up with what's going on. Well, all of this was happening anyway. And I wrote a book called The Shift about it, and so on and so forth. I honestly didn't see companies doing anything at all differently. I thought, my goodness, I'm going to retire and companies are going to just be exactly the same. Well, March 2021, March the 24th, or 14th actually for us in London, we shut down. And we still shut down. We're just beginning to open. Some of my colleagues of course, in Melbourne. I kept a diary, thinking, oh, I'll keep a diary. I'll probably have, a couple of volumes. Can you see that? Volume 18. Now, of course, all my friends were journalists saying, oh, gosh, I wish I kept a diary. Well, I did. And that's why I was able to write so quickly my new book, The New Long Life, Redesigning Work, which will be out on March the 3rd. You can pre-order it whenever you want. It has been astounding. Anyone who's as old as I am, and I know that Len, you're even older than I am, we know that this has never happened before. And both Len and I lived through the last crisis, the big financial crisis. I know that very well. Len, I don't know if you remember, I was the Lehman professor at London Business School during the financial crisis. So when Lehman went down, my whole research team went down with it, unfortunately. But this is completely astounding. And, one of the ways to think about this is to think about it with regard to a sort of simple notion of change. And one of the ideas of thinking about change is that in most organizations, the organization is in a state of what you might call freeze. That's not a bad thing, by the way. It just means that things are pretty stable. And then sometimes something happens, a competitor comes along that changes it. There's a big merger and acquisition, whatever. And the organization goes into a state of unfreeze and it begins to change. And then over time, it refreezes. Well, this astounding thing about the pandemic is we all unfroze at the same time. And that I don't think we've quite understood that yet, that it wasn't that one single company unfroze, it was that every company. I followed Fujitsu in Japan, and in fact, it was the opening case for my Harvard Business Review article on hybrid working. Japan, for those of you who know it, are in love with their offices. Japanese business people go to their office all the time. They stay there. They spend weekends there. They spend endless hours there. They just love their offices. Well, within 3 days, Fujitsu had sent 60,000 people to work from their small apartments in the suburbs of Tokyo. And actually what the CEO of Fujitsu told me at the time was, and part of the reason I put them into the HBR article is I wanted that to be in print. in case he wanted to change his mind. But he said, we're not going back. And in fact, we talked to Fujitsu today, they're not going back. So this is an astounding moment. And of course, look, I'm not saying that we learned a lot. And I've just got 6 things that, I've learned, but I'm sure there's many things that you've learned as well. One is we worked harder. And those of us who normally work in offices, we didn't commute. And what we did, and actually the Microsoft data that's just come out on email use, and Erin, you're probably as aware of that as I am, show that people in general switched on their computers an hour before they normally did, and they switched them off an hour. Productivity went up primarily because we worked longer hours. I don't really think that's sustainable, but that's what's happened. You're now seeing burnout. And actually the group I'm most worried about, and it'd be interesting to see if others feel the same, is managers. I'm working with I'm doing a piece of research with Diana Gerson, who's just stepped down as CHRO at IBM, on managers. We think there's a crisis of management right now. These are almost unsustainable jobs. They were always pretty tough. They're now almost unsustainable. Huge energy depletion, big impact on mental health. Networks tried to really change. I know most of you don't measure the networks in your organizations, but what we heard people say, and we now know because there has been some studies on networks since the pandemic, is that they've constricted. You've spent more time with people that you know, less time with strangers, bumping into people, serendipity. And people are wondering, well, where's the creativity going? Something happened to leaders. We wanted them to be empathic. We never really wanted our leaders to be empathic, but now we really did. And also, those of you who know John Rawls' work will understand what I mean when I say the veil of ignorance was lifted, in the sense that suddenly leaders saw the everyday lives of people. They saw that they had kids at home. They saw that they were exhausted. They began to understand what it was to be the other. And again, Erin, I know that that's something I'm sure interested in. Your identity is quite a lot about how you see the other. And the final thing is, we really realized that boundary management was important, and we weren't doing it very well. And we're still not doing it very well. We're still having 8 hours of Zoom meetings every day. And that's a big mistake. And perhaps we'll have time to talk about that. So what's ahead? Well, let me make a couple of points there. I think it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. I did an interview which was broadcast today with Stu Friedman. Some of you might know from Wharton. He's a great friend of mine from Wharton. And he said, honestly, if we all go back to this, shame on all of us. And I totally agree with him that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. He said, the only mistake we make is if we don't learn and we don't change. So, huge experiments going on, some of them in Canada, actually. I wrote in my book about CPP Investments, some of whom you know very well, who have done astounding things with helping their most talented people think about how could I have a more flexible way of living. The dynamics of the labour market are a factor. I think it's great that so many people are saying they're going to leave a job. I think it's really been a wake-up call, actually. My suspicion is they're not going to all leave, but certainly people have come out of lockdown and said, why am I doing this? Surge in digital investment and capability, and really no way back. So here's just really 3 or 4 things to take into consideration before we open for questions. Number 1, human skills were always important, but they're just going to be ever more important now. They're crucial for managers, the emotional, the listening, the empathy, and so on. So we have to really begin to build work that allows humans to be humans. I think automation is going to be a very positive thing. I don't see it as a negative, but it does mean that we have to really help people develop their human skills. And those require a rested brain. They require a brain that's rested, that's focused. Number 2, if you think you're going to live to 100 and at a time of astounding technological churn and change, then the 3-stage model of full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement looks ridiculous. And I'm very interested, and I talked about this in my last book, in social pioneers. I like when I sort of look at identity, and maybe Erin, you do the same, I like to look at the outliers, because it's really in the outliers that you begin to see, well, you know, often people follow outliers. So who are the outliers at the moment? Well, they're the people who are starting their own business in their 50s. They're the people who are taking a gap year when they're 40. They're the people who are building a portfolio in their 30s, who are saying in their 30s, I want to do volunteer work and I want to do paid work. They're the people who are saying, I need to take two years off to spend time with my children, my friends, and so on and so forth. Now, that's really what people want. And organizations have an opportunity now to reconfigure to provide that. And part of the way they're going to do that is their response to new ways of working. Now, I'm very conscious of the fact that we have to be extremely careful as we emerge from the pandemic to imagine that everybody works in an office. I was with a whole bunch of people today where only 20% of their people work in an office. Some of them work in factories, some of them are doctors in medical institutions, some of them are vets, some of them are delivery people. So, you know, we have to be conscious that what we say about the new ways of working doesn't look as if it looks unfair to people who aren't able to take it. And that's why in my Harvard Business Review article, and indeed in my new book, Redesigning Work, I invite you not just to talk about place in terms of, you know, office versus anywhere, but also to invite you to talk about time. And so really, you know, what you have an opportunity to think about is, where is it that people are going to work? And that means, of course, redesigning the office, but also when are they going to work? And I think what we've learned from the pandemic is asynchronous work. Synchronous and asynchronous work is really possible. We are currently engaged in synchronous work. We are all here together. We're not here physically together, but because of the marvel of low-cost technology, we are actually here together. This is an astounding skill that we've learned during the pandemic. Let's make sure we bring that in to the way we think about time. Because if I can connect with you like that, that doesn't mean I want to spend all my time connecting with you, but it means I could also have time disconnecting and working on my own, doing focused work, but I can also coordinate with you. So I think we have an opportunity to really learn about hybrid, but also to take into consideration some of these aspects of time. And let me finish as I hand over to Erin and then to Len to say, how are we going to do this? And I want to make 3 suggestions about what we actually do to make this happen. Number 1, we build a narrative for leaders. The great conversation I had with Stu Friedman yesterday, which was shown today, was about leaders' narrative. People are looking for leaders, not to talk about rules, you know, you've got to be in the office 3 days a week or 2 days a week, or I don't know, whatever it is, actually to talk about principles and values. And those principles and values are what's going to help us get through what could be, I think, a pretty tricky year ahead. So what we know is that leaders' narratives are most compelling if they are positive. We know as psychologists that actually it's positive messages that help people change, not fear messages. Fear messages stop adults from learning. They don't help adults to learn. And secondly, a narrative that actually relates to the individual, that's authentic to the leader. So Stu at the moment, and I in my own way as well, are really encouraging leaders to create a story of the future that people find positive and compelling. Secondly, I talk about co-creation with employees. You know, I had such an interesting day today with the 100 people that we work with in our research consortium on the future of work from all over the world, actually. And they're all struggling. There isn't, I don't think, a single company out there that says, I got it right. I don't know anyone who feels that. And it's potentially pretty difficult. You know, what happens if you're in a team where half the people say they want to work from home, half want to work in the evening? I don't know. It's just a nightmare. So people have got to talk about it. They've got to become accountable for what's going on, and they've got to be able to co-create with each other. And that's why in the work that we've been doing, we've built platforms. We have a platform that allows, you know, tens of thousands of people to talk together about what it is they want. This process of co-creation with your employees is going to be absolutely crucial. And thirdly, as I said earlier, I do think that Diana and I are just rewriting this piece at the moment. And yesterday we said, okay, we're going to use the word crisis. We weren't going to, but we actually think it's a crisis of managers. They're completely overwhelmed. They were always pretty much overwhelmed, but now they have no idea how to do this. And so we have to find all sorts of ways of supporting them, of using AI and bots to take some of their work away from them, to help them focus on what's going to be really crucial in the future, which is coaching, counseling, showing empathy. Back to you, Erin. I'm going to stop sharing.
And thank you so much, Lynda.
I can look at these great comments as well.
Yes, so many comments, so many questions. That was just a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. I wanted to pick up on the theme of burnout. I noticed that there were a few comments about this in the chat. Zabine and also Krista were mentioning that they're seeing burnout with managers and seeing people working way longer hours. And of course, you referenced this study that showed that people have basically replaced their commuting time with more time in the office and in meetings, right? So there's lots of burnout among managers, leaders, employees, parents of young children who are in COVID classrooms and have to isolate. What can we do?
Well, I think first of all, Erin, we have to acknowledge this. And I was just, one of the cases we looked at this morning was the Ministry of Justice in the UK. Mm-hmm. And what they've said is, as we come out of COVID and think about productivity, we are going to put well-being and mental health as part of that equation. So we're not going to say mental health and well-being is something that's quite nice to have. They're saying it drives productivity. It's an actual driver of productivity. And so what they're doing is that they've looked in detail at issues of well-being and come up with a whole range of solutions, Erin, to how they sort that out. For example, you know, and some of these things are micro behaviors. For example, saying, you know, don't have too many Zoom meetings, don't back-to-back them, switch off your video, it's a whole bunch of stuff, but really acknowledging that this has been a very difficult time for people. I know I'm exhausted, and I'm pretty fortunate in the sense that I don't do, my son's on A&E. I have one of my sons is on accident and emergency. I mean, he's like a zombie at the moment. So you know, I can't really talk about how exhausted I am, but I think honestly, we're exhausted. And I think part of the reason people are looking to change their job is they want to change their life. And I don't think there's going to be a marvelous job waiting for them, by the way, but it is a wake-up call that actually we are exhausted and that we have now got to build. And it's interesting, Zabine, you use the word resilience. And somebody else said, well, what are people thinking about in Japan? Japan is using the word resilience a lot at the moment. I'm doing a piece tomorrow morning in Japan, the marvel of Zoom, of course. And it's going to be, I'm talking to all of the people in the Automobile Association. So that's Toyota and all that. The theme of the whole conference is resilience. So I think, you know, and we've realized we've got to build resilience into all our systems, not just our work system. But actually, I just think we've pushed things too far. And this is the moment for us to change things. And Erin, I think you're right that well-being has got to be at the center of our notions of productivity.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So on productivity, we have a question here from Lindsay Ryan, who says, hello, Lynda and Erin. If a third of our tasks will be automated, will that leave room in people's days for more freedom? Or do you think managers will fill the time with additional tasks? So will employees' portfolios of work increase to match these new efficiencies? What do you see happening?
It's a really, really good question. If you look at the data over a long period of time, as work has been automated, the hours of work have gone down. And so we do now work fewer hours than people before the Industrial Revolution did, or indeed during the factories of the Industrial Revolution. So work has gone down. It's gone down for everybody except for one group, Erin, and those are the highly paid. And the highly paid still work very long hours. Now, I think what we're going to see, by the way, and sorry, this is not the answer to the question, but it's an answer I would think you might be interested in. I think we're going to see a lot of diversity. As we come out, organizations are going to start describing the deal. And you're going to have to do that in your organization. And I think you'll see a lot of diversity. You can already see that. So the investment banks, the lawyers are basically saying the deal is about money and we're going to pay you more. So they're in an arms race. I don't know if you're noticing that in Canada, but certainly in the UK. I mean, every single week, the starting salary of a graduate into investment banking goes up. It is an arms race, which, and I don't, and I know that the Goldman Sachs people said, yeah, the young ones said, we work too many hours. I would say, honestly, that was the deal. What did you think was going to happen? You got paid 120,000. You have to work very long hours. If you don't want to do that, don't join Goldman Sachs. So I think, what we have to realize is that there are many types of people who want to do many different things, and organizations similarly have to have a much bigger sort of ecosystem of ways of working. And there will be some companies in response to the question about automation who say, we're automating and that will allow us to give people more time off. And there will be others who are saying, we are automating and we want people to continue to work long hours. And we'll just see who joins those companies. And of course, unless you have union representation, which of course lots of people in the gig economy don't, it's very difficult to push back on some of those issues.
That's such an interesting way to think about it, that we will see these different kinds of deals emerging.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see it, because we're sort of fortunate because we have about 40 companies that we follow, and we spend, yesterday I talked to a whole bunch of companies and I was saying to them, what are you expecting to do? So we actually have prior knowledge of what's coming into the market, and there is a lot of variety coming in,
That's exciting. That's good.
Yeah, it's exciting. Good. You can make a choice. Basically, it means employees have got more choice.
Good. So there's an interesting question here from Colin Gillies. I mean, all the questions are interesting. I'm just trying to, follow a stream. But Colin Gillies asks, doesn't corporate culture, ethics, et cetera, suffer when people are uncoupled from their peers and random contact in real life? Monoculture is unsustainable and less inventive.
Yeah, I think that's such a good question, Colin. I mean, first response to that is, I think very few companies are going to have it where you work from home all the time. I think that's very unlikely. There are companies that are entirely virtual, and actually even before, the very first 2 weeks of COVID, I was on a BBC panel with the CEO of Artemis Connection, which is based in Oregon, I think. It's a strategy company, completely virtual. And I said to them exactly your question, actually, Colin, which is to say, well, hang on, don't you think people suffer because you're entirely virtual? They said two things. Number one, because we know we're all virtual, we build in a lot of connections. Actually, there's two things. Number two, because we're virtual, some people don't like to join us. So, again, coming back to Erin, your point, there's more diversity. And number three, and this is really interesting, Colin, the people who join us spend more time in their community making contacts. So, part of the really interesting story here is what's going to happen to cities. In fact, the piece I'm doing in Japan tomorrow is for one of the new cities of Japan. And their hope is that as people work from home, they will make just as many connections, but their peer group move from their colleagues to their neighbours. Colin, I don't know what you think about that, but I think that's a really interesting hypothesis. I'd love to, if anyone's got any views on that, I'd love to hear it. Certainly I did that. I spent much more time in my community since I've been locked down. I live in Primrose Hill. I've seen my neighbours. I've shopped locally. And I'm not going to give that up, frankly. So I think people will always have human connections. The question is, Colin, who are they going to have it with?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So I had some questions about the beginning of your talk when you were talking about longevity and its effects for the workplace. And I see a question here from Goran Salik. How will an older and more experienced workforce impact the employability and career prospects of young people, such as university graduates? And to give a concrete example that I sort of mull over, if CEOs are, maybe now the average age of a CEO is about 60, if going forward, the average age of a CEO is going to be 75 or 80. What does that mean for younger people in those companies?
Well, sorry, this is a bit of an old-fashioned strategy response, but the strategy response would be you don't fight about the size of the cake, you build the cake, you make the bigger cake. And actually what we know is that when older people carry on working, they create opportunities for younger people, they pay more tax, they build businesses. I run a business where I employ 20 people. And so, it's not that you all have to fight about what work. You can actually create more work. Now, so the point I think, Erin, you're making is, if somebody's 70 and they're a CEO, does it mean you can't, does that stop everybody else? Yeah, it probably does. So that's great. They can leave and start their own businesses or do something different. I mean, I think we have to sort of see the labor market in a much more flexible way. And honestly, I think spending time to start your own business is a very, very smart thing to do. And it's interesting. One of the things that Unilever's done right now is that they've said, we want to give people more flexibility for things like starting your own business. So what we're going to do is we've created something called the third way. And the third way is that you join after you've been there a couple of years, you get a low base salary, and then you get paid for the projects you do, but you have access to Unilever's training, skills, their whole sort of, project management scheduling thing. And actually what they're finding is quite a lot of people are using their time to start their own business. I think a portfolio life, frankly, is a lot more resilient than a single focused working life. I think if you're just with one company, you're leaving yourself very vulnerable, as your questioner said, to the fact that the CEO is never going to budge.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting that Unilever is attacking this in this really positive way. It's great.
Yeah.
It reminds me of Google, where I believe the engineers can all spend 20% of their time on their own projects.
Well, those are projects for Google, though, I think. I don't know if I'm not sure about that, Erin. I would have to check. Somebody I'm sure can be checking that. But I think they want it's all Google time. But I could be wrong.
So there are some questions here. Right. There's some questions here about work redesign. So Carrie Jothan asks, how do you see the redesign of work playing out in different sectors? For example, redesigning work in a manufacturing plant versus a construction site versus food or retail versus other completely different sectors. How will this be manifested in small versus large businesses and corporations?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, Kerry. And again, I think there will be quite a lot of diversity, but I wouldn't sort of stereotype, construction versus food versus manufacturing, because some organizations are going to use values and principles as a way of attracting and retaining talent. So, for example, this morning, one of the companies that we're engaged with is a construction company, and they are thinking about redesigning work with as much flair as Unilever is thinking about it. So I think it's a lot to do with the leadership and how they see their own organization as much as the sector and what the sector is doing. I don't know about you, Erin, but I see quite a lot of divergence within sectors. And some organizations are really trying to position themselves as an employer of choice in the sector that they operate in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, lots of diversity in those different groups. That actually reminds me of what you were saying earlier about different deals, right? Perhaps even within the same sector, there winds up being different deals available to people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So there's a related question here from Vivian. You spoke a fair bit about automation in your presentation, and Vivian asks, how do you foresee automation impacting job security? Are there any sectors that you foresee being at risk of reducing workforce size?
Well, yes, I mean, without a doubt. But in some cases, it can't be fast enough. You know, it's interesting. One of the things that people have said is with autonomous vehicles, it's going to be terrible for for truck drivers. And Andrew Scott and I, in the New Long Life, actually talked about this particular issue of lorry drivers and said, in fact, this can't come fast enough, because actually lorry driving isn't a great job. It's got high levels of physical health problems. It's mostly done by people who are older and they want to retire. And actually, we can't get automation fast enough. So there's no question that most of us are in jobs which are going to change. It's unlikely that any job completely disappears. You probably know the data on this, Erin, that the only job that's actually disappeared from the category of jobs is a person who stands in an elevator lift and presses the button for you. I think you can still get that at Claridge's, but I don't think there's very many places in the world where there's somebody pressing the elevator button for you. So that job actually has disappeared from the categories, but very few haven't. But the labor market is changing all the time. You know, for example, there's going to be 30 million digital jobs created. So this is why this focus on upskilling and reskilling is so important. And part of what I try to do at the World Economic Forum in the council that I co-chair is to make apparent what these new jobs are and how people make the transitions to get there. And those of you who follow my work will know that I have a column in MIT Sloan, which comes out, I think I do it every 8 weeks or something. And I've been banging on about upskilling and reskilling quite a lot about that. Just go to my website, by the way, www.lindagratton.com, and you'll find it all there. And actually really shown how some companies, Microsoft, for example, is a great example of a company that's really investing in upskilling people so they can do jobs that are different from the jobs they already have. So I think one doesn't need to be concerned about the impact of automation, but one does need to be aware that we all have to upskill and reskill.
Mm-hmm. So that leads me back to the very first question that's posted here from Gerald Kelly, who asked, in the digital jobs age, what role will liberal arts education play?
I don't know about you, Gerald. I just think it's going to be even greater because of creativity. I was saying to Erin that I've just got back. It's the Frieze Fair in London today. In fact, I should have been drinking champagne right now, so I'm feeling a bit sad about that. But look, these are the pictures that I've taken just today. I don't know if you probably can't see that, of all the amazing pictures that I saw, and I will certainly look at those and think about them. I think liberal arts education is absolutely crucial. We need historians. We need people who understand the arts. I learn a lot from opera. I was hoping to write a piece actually with the Royal Opera House, and we didn't get around to it, but just what opera can teach us about the management of complex projects. So I think, Gerald, if anything, it's more important than it's ever been.
Great. And I'm going to take you to the last question now, which is from Mary Friedman, which is also about the future of work. And Mary asks, and I remember in your slides, you showed pictures of families and you talked about how women had jobs, not careers, et cetera. But Mary asks, what opportunities do you see for women in the future of work? There are specific challenges for women, many of whom are balancing their traditional work with multiple new challenges, including caring for children and parents.
Yeah. I think, look, I think that's such an important point, and there's been some amazing scholarly work on this issue. I have to say, I was really disappointed to see the data that showed that during the pandemic, in most families, working women still continue to do more domestic labor, and caring responsibilities, even when the man and the woman was at home. I found that disappointing, actually. And what I say to my MBA students, and we have about 35% women at London Business School. In the program I teach, the executive program is 50-50. Is I say, it's not about women leaning in, it's about men stepping up. And, I do think that organizations need to understand that caring is a human responsibility. It's not a female responsibility. And actually, it's only going to get more important because we're having fewer children, but our parents are living longer. And so, it's the sad reality of our lives is that we're likely to spend more time looking after our aged parents than we are after our young kids. So, one of the things that I've written about is how important it is for organizations to acknowledge fathers and to celebrate, being a father. I don't know about in Canada. I know in America, parental leave is absolutely dreadful. In Europe, it's much better. But certainly to acknowledge that both mothers and fathers have responsibilities for their children, and that many parents want to share parenting. So organizations have to be a great deal more sensitive to that. And of course, part of the reason women tended to do the domestic work is they didn't get paid as much. But actually, the gender pay gap is decreasing all the time. And at this stage, there's no reason to say it should always be the woman who does the caring responsibilities. And I noticed that that men now want to really be involved in parenting. And we know that parenting is good for guys. They're more likely to establish good relationships with their kids, and they're less likely to get divorced. So, what's the complete win-win on that one?
Yes. In fact, someone sent me this morning a new article in Harvard Business Review, written with McKinsey, about men who took 2 months of leave after their children were born, and all of the positive effects for them.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And the data has been clear on that, Erin, before that men who take paternity leave have better relationships with their kids. It sort of makes sense, doesn't it? And this is the sort of tragedy of Japan, and part of the reason I'm spending quite a lot of time in Japan at the moment, on Zoom. I don't mean physically there, sadly. It's because Japanese men have been so disconnected from their families, and the young ones are so upset about that and really don't want that to be like their dads. And so what you're seeing in Japan is a real sort of push for younger men to say, I want to spend time with my kids. My dad never saw me. I don't want that to happen to me.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, on that note, I'm just mindful of your time and everyone's time. And we've had such a lovely conversation. I haven't been able to get through all of the questions. I see there's more comments in the chat now. So great conversation, great talk. Thank you so much for visiting with us. And I'm going to pass it over to Len Waverman now, who is director of our Foresight Lab here at McMaster School of Business.
Thanks, Erin, and thanks, Lynda. So Erin is one of our associate professors in human HR organizational behavior, and she has a BCom from actually the group and a PhD in psychology from Harvard. And we're lucky that she's come back. She's an out-of-the-box thinker, as is Lynda. Her work, actually, on the last comment, when she did a thesis, she wondered, all these studies are on women in the workforce. What about the men in the workforce? Nobody's looking at them. And what she found was that men exaggerate the hours that they work. Many cases lie about them, take time off, but don't tell the firm because they're not home taking care of the baby. They just leave. And she's continued this trend of out of the box thinking. She's a top under 40, and on the radar of Thinkers 50, where Lynda Gratton is also there. And you've seen from Lynda the amazing insights she has. It is extraordinary that she's able to gather all this, and is not pedestrian. It is just from the first moment, you just saw thoughts and that I'd never thought of when looking at things like automation and the change in the nature of the organization. If we had time, I'd ask her about the change in the nature of education. We talk a lot about lifelong learning, but really on the old model is we're training people to go into a job, and then they leave that job, and when they get their degree, we say bye, and call us when you get money, so we can donate. So, but all this feeds into. Let me talk a little bit the Foresight Lab. What is foresight? It's not forecasting. It's looking into the future 5 to 10 years out. And Lynda gave us a lot of ideas as to why it's critical to do that, and why she went back at the beginning looking at the key trends, not getting lost in the pandemic today, because that will become an endemic, we'll live with it, but it's also the key trends and the changes that the pandemic has led to. So the future is not predetermined, it's not predictable, but the future outcomes can be influenced by our choices in the present. And that's what the science of foresight is to make the probable your firm's goal. So to work within the firm to look into these possible futures and say, what does this mean? So, for example, if we look at living to 100, what will that do for your firm? What are the opportunities and the challenges? So, the Foresight Lab at the Groot is funded by the Future of Canada project of McMaster. We have a set of webinars like these. We'll have more. We also have a number of short courses. There's one on technology forecasting, October 20th and 27th, and one on leading change for innovation and impact, November 17th and December 1st. It's 2 half days each. And again, it's with this lens, not the forecast technology, but what do all these trends, could they mean for your organization, and how do you think about it? So thank you all for being here. Thank you very much, Lynda and Aaron. And we'll see you again on our next webinar, which is, Andrea will tell me the date it is. Stay in touch, look at our website, and we welcome you to stay with us in the future. Thanks again, Lynda and Aaron. Bye for now.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
This was lovely.
Thank you. Thanks very much.